That evening, Harold and I ate at the kitchen table instead of in front of the television. I had set out the good bowls, not the holiday china, but the white ones with the thin blue rim that I usually saved for company. He noticed, of course. Men notice changes in the house before they notice changes in a woman's heart. He looked at the bowl and said, "What's the occasion?" I said, "Saturday is our anniversary." He nodded while buttering his bread. "That's right." That was all. 40 years, and 2 words laid on the table like loose change. I wanted to ask if he remembered the rented hall with the waxed floor, my mother crying into a lace handkerchief, his hand shaking when he put the ring on me. I wanted to ask if he remembered how poor we were, how we slept under 2 coats that first winter because the old apartment heat barely worked, how I cut my wedding dress shorter after the ceremony so I could wear it again to church. I wanted to ask if any of that still lived in him. But I had asked for things in that way before, gently, circling the wound, hoping the other person would understand without feeling accused. It never worked. People who benefit from your silence are not always eager to translate it. So I said something plain. "I want us to go out Saturday. Just us." Harold frowned as if I had suggested we climb onto the roof. "Out where?" "To dinner," I said. "Somewhere with cloth napkins. I want to wear my green dress." He took a spoonful of soup and looked toward the window. "Seems like a lot of fuss." There it was. Not cruelty, not shouting, just the quiet lowering of my desire until it looked foolish even to me. For many years, that little sentence would have been enough to fold me back into myself. I would have smiled, said he was right, and made meatloaf on Saturday. I would have told myself not to be dramatic. I would have made everyone comfortable and then wondered why my own soul felt homeless. But something had already shifted in that hallway by the telephone. I said, "It may seem like fuss to you, Harold. It matters to me." He stared at me then, not angrily, more confused than anything, as if the chair across from him had suddenly spoken. That night, after he went to bed, I stayed downstairs. The rain had stopped, and the house had that damp silence after weather passes through. I washed the dishes slowly, dried them, put them behind the glass cabinet doors, and then I did something I had not done in years. I opened the drawer where we kept old stationery, sat at the table, and wrote down what I wanted before I died. I do not mean wild dreams. I did not write about Paris or pearls or anything grand. I wrote small things because small things had been missing first. I want mornings that belong to me. I want to stop apologizing when I need rest. I want to sit at a table and be listened to until I finish my sentence. I want my children to know me as a person, not just as the place where help comes from. I want to stop waiting for people to become grateful before I allow myself peace. The pencil shook in my hand. Not because I was weak, but because truth can feel dangerous when you have avoided it for too long. The next morning, I put the phone in the drawer after breakfast. That sounds like nothing now, when phones follow people into bathrooms and beds and grocery aisles. But back then, our telephone sat in the hallway like a little command post. It rang, and I answered. Someone needed a ride, a favor, a casserole, a listening ear, a small loan, a spare hour, a piece of me. So I put it in the drawer of my mind, if not with my hands. I decided I would not run every time it rang. At 9 o'clock, Marianne called. I let it ring. At 9:05, my younger son called. I let it ring. At 9:10, I felt so guilty I stood in the hallway with one hand pressed against my stomach. But I did not answer. Instead, I made the bed properly. I opened the windows. I put on a clean blouse, though no one was coming. I walked to the grocery store with my old brown coat buttoned all the way up and bought 2 apples, a loaf of bread, and a small bunch of yellow flowers that cost more than they should have. On the way home, I passed Mrs. Alvarez from 2 houses down. She was sitting on her porch with a blanket over her knees, watching the street as if she had misplaced something out there. She waved me over. I almost said I had soup to heat and laundry to fold. I almost used chores as a hiding place, the way I had done for years. But I stopped. She looked at the flowers in my bag and said, "Are those for someone?" I looked down at them, embarrassed by my own small act of wanting. Then I said, "For my kitchen." She smiled in a way that made her whole tired face soften. "Good," she said. "A kitchen should know it is loved too." I laughed, but something in my throat tightened, because that was the first kind sentence I had heard all week that asked nothing from me, and I did not yet know that this small conversation on a damp sidewalk would become the beginning of my freedom. Mrs. Alvarez was 78 then, widowed almost 10 years, and she had the sort of face that had learned not to ask too loudly for anything. Her porch had 2 metal chairs, a chipped flower pot with nothing growing in it, and a little table where she kept a glass of water covered with a napkin. I remember those details because lonely people often arrange their small spaces carefully. They are not decorating, they are proving to themselves that they are still here. She asked me to sit for a minute. I did. At first we talked about ordinary things, the rain, the price of eggs, the neighbor's dog that barked like it had unpaid debts. Then she said, "My daughter wants me to move in with her." I told her that sounded kind. She looked at me, and I knew before she spoke that kindness was not the whole story. "She says it will be easier," Mrs. Alvarez said, "but she does not mean easier for me." That sentence stayed with me, because families can make plans for an older person in the language of love, while quietly removing their choices one drawer at a time. A bedroom becomes too much house. A familiar street becomes not practical. A routine becomes stubbornness. And if you are not careful, people will call it care when they are really taking away the last pieces of your authority. I did not understand how much that warning would matter later. That Saturday, I wore the green dress. Harold complained about parking, about prices, about the restaurant being too dim to read the menu. But I had curled my hair, put on lipstick, and carried myself through that doorway like a woman attending her own rescue. The waiter called me ma'am, with respect. A candle sat between us. Someone was playing piano softly near the bar, and for the first time in a long while, I felt the strange ache of being visible. Halfway through dinner, Harold looked at me and said, "You've been different." I said, "I know." He waited for me to explain myself, the way I always had. I would usually rush in with reasons, apologies, reassurance, anything to make the other person comfortable with my pain. This time, I took a sip of water first. Then I said, "I am tired of living as if my needs are an interruption." He looked down at his plate. It was not a grand conversation. He did not suddenly become tender in the way films make men become tender. He did not reach across the table and tell me he had been blind. Real life is rarely that generous, but he did something important. He did not argue. Sometimes at 55, that is enough room to begin. In the weeks after that anniversary, I made changes so small nobody could accuse me of rebellion, but they saved me, piece by piece. I stopped answering the phone before breakfast. Morning became mine. I washed my face, made tea, opened the curtains, and sat at the table for 10 whole minutes before anyone else's needs entered the room. I stopped giving explanations longer than the request deserved. When I could not babysit, I said, "I cannot do that day." When someone asked why, I said, "I already have plans." At first, my plans were only a walk, a library visit, or a quiet afternoon mending a sweater. But I learned that a plan does not become real only when someone else approves of it. I began writing down what I had done each day, not to impress anyone, to stop my own life from disappearing. Washed curtains, made bean soup, walked with Mrs. Alvarez, called Helen, rested without guilt. Those little lines became proof that my days had shape. I dressed properly at home, not fancy. Just clean, brushed, awake. A cardigan without stains, shoes instead of slippers until evening. It changed how I moved through the rooms. It reminded me that I was not furniture in my own house. I cooked real food for myself, even when Harold was out or the children were busy. For years, I had eaten scraps standing by the sink, the torn corner of toast, the last spoonful from a pot, the piece nobody wanted. Then one afternoon, I set a place for myself, sliced a tomato, warmed soup, and sat down. I remember thinking, this is how a person tells her body it is still worth caring for. But then I noticed something worse. The more I respected my own life, the more uncomfortable some people became. Marianne said, "Mom, you're not acting like yourself." My son said, "Since when are you so busy?" Even Harold, in his quieter way, watched me as if I had joined a secret society. For a while, their confusion hurt me. I wondered whether I had become selfish. That word can frighten a woman who has survived by being useful. It can send her running back to the old cage with a clean apron on. Then one afternoon, Mrs. Alvarez knocked on my back door carrying 2 chipped mugs and a tin of cinnamon cookies. She stepped into my kitchen, saw the yellow flowers on the table, and said, "You kept buying them." I said, "Every Friday." She nodded. "Good. Let them get used to it." "Who?" She looked around my kitchen, then back at me. "Everyone." And that was when I realized something I wish I had learned 30 years earlier. People do not always respect the first boundary. Sometimes they only begin respecting the woman who keeps it. Mrs. Alvarez became my Friday visitor. Not officially. We never announced it. There was no club, no calendar, no proper invitation. She simply began coming through the back gate after lunch, carrying whatever she had made too much of, and I would put on the kettle. Sometimes we sat in the kitchen with the windows open. Sometimes we sat on her porch and watched people come home from work. Two old women, one not as old as she thought she was, and one older than she was willing to admit, learning how to be seen again without making a performance of it. It did not solve everything. That is important to say. My children did not suddenly become deeply attentive. Harold did not turn into a poet. The house did not fill with apologies. But I had stopped arranging my whole spirit around what other people failed to give me. That was the beginning of peace. One Sunday, Marianne came over with the boys. They were little then, all elbows and noise, leaving fingerprints on the glass doors and crumbs under the table. I had made stew, and the smell of onions and bay leaf filled the kitchen. After lunch, Marianne began gathering their jackets. "Can you take them next Saturday?" she asked. "Just for a few hours." I wiped the table slowly. I remember the cloth in my hand, damp and warm from the dishwater. "I cannot next Saturday," I said. Her mouth tightened. "What are you doing?" "I am going to the library in the morning, and then Mrs. Alvarez and I are helping at the church supper." She looked almost offended. "You can go to the library any time." There it was again, the old invitation to step out of my own life. But this time, I did not defend myself. I did not list reasons. I did not soften the boundary until it became useless. I said, "Not this Saturday." The boys were chasing each other around the hallway, laughing. Harold was in the living room with the newspaper. The stew pot sat soaking in the sink. Nothing dramatic happened. No music rose, no door slammed. But inside me, something stood up straight. That was the day I understood that dignity often arrives quietly. It does not always feel like victory. Sometimes it feels like a woman keeping her voice calm while her heart pounds under her blouse. Marianne did not like it. For several weeks, she called less. I will not pretend that did not hurt. A mother can know she is right and still miss the sound of her child's voice. I would stand by the hallway sometimes, looking at that telephone, fighting the urge to call and apologize for having a life. But I did not. Instead, I made soup for the church supper. I folded napkins. I walked with Mrs. Alvarez to the library. I read books that had nothing to do with improving anyone else's comfort. I planted parsley in a pot by the kitchen window and felt foolishly proud when it grew. That little pot taught me more than some sermons. A living thing needs light. It needs water. It needs room. You cannot keep cutting from it and call yourself generous when all that is left is a stem. Years passed. Harold softened in small ways. Not perfectly, but enough for me to notice. He began asking, "Do you have plans today?" instead of assuming I had none. Sometimes he put the kettle on before I came downstairs. Once on a Friday, he came home with yellow flowers and placed them on the table without a word. I did not make a speech about it. I just touched his shoulder as I passed. By the time I was 65, I no longer feared growing old the same way. By 75, I understood that being needed is not enough. A person must also be known. By 85, after Harold was gone and the house became quiet in a different way, I had already practiced living with myself. That saved me from becoming desperate for any scrap of attention. And now, at 95, people ask me whether I am afraid of the end. I am not brave every minute. Let us not make me into something I am not. Some nights when the wind presses against the windows and my knees ache, I think about the narrowness of time. I think about the faces already gone. I think about my mother's hands, Harold's old slippers by the bed, Mrs. Alvarez laughing with cookie crumbs on her cardigan. I miss more people than I can name before sleep comes. But fear is no longer the owner of my house. I stopped fearing the end 40 years ago because I finally became present for my own life. I stopped waiting for my children to prove I mattered. I stopped treating my body like a tool and my heart like a storage room for everyone else's troubles. I stopped begging people to notice what I had never dared to protect. Listen carefully to an old woman now. Do not wait until your hands shake to claim your mornings. Do not wait until everyone is finished needing you before you decide you deserve rest. Do not spend your life standing by the sink eating what is left, then wonder why nobody saved you a chair. Put the phone away sometimes. Make the bed for yourself. Wear the good cardigan on an ordinary day. Cook a real meal even if you eat alone. Write down what you did so your days do not vanish without witness. Say no without turning it into a courtroom defense. Keep one promise each week that belongs only to your soul, and find someone who asks nothing from you except your true company. That may be a neighbor, a grandchild, an old friend, a woman at church, a man sitting alone on a park bench. Do not overlook the quiet people. Some of them are carrying the same ache with a different name. The end will come for all of us. I will not pretend otherwise. But there is a great difference between leaving a life you have inhabited and leaving one you only maintained for other people. I am not finished yet. This morning, I opened my curtains, watered the parsley, warmed a bowl of soup, and sat at the table while the light moved across the floor. My hands are thinner now, my steps are slower, but the chair is mine, the morning is mine, the breath in my chest is still mine. And when the time comes, I do not want my last thought to be, why did I never live? I want it to be much quieter than that. I want to know that at last I belong to myself.